Can we turn back in our Bibles then to the passage that we read together in the book of Esther, and in chapter 5 of that book, which you'll find on page 504, 505. I want to read again verse 13. We're going to look at the whole chapter, but just to focus our attention for a moment on verse 13. Esther 5, verse 13. This is Mordecai, so this is Haman speaking after he's been boasting of everything he has and the height he has achieved in life and in authority. But he says in verse 13, "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate." All this gives me no satisfaction. I wonder if you ever find that no matter how good life gets, there's always something or someone that spoils it. That was the case for Haman, certainly. He's second in command of the Persian Empire. Effectively, he's the leader. The king just does what he says. But and now the queen is inviting him to her banquets, wanting him apparently to be her new bestie. And yet he's got a niggle going on. He's over the moon about the invitation to the banquet. He's delighted leaving there knowing that he's got another invitation to another one. But then he meets Mordecai. And that man's existence makes Haman's blood boil. He's got everything, and yet he is deeply unhappy. Deeply unhappy. And it's basically a reminder to us today that this world's pleasures and all that it has to offer us, as much as these things might delight us for a time, they will never make you truly happy. They will never fully satisfy you, because there'll always be something else, either that you need or something else that niggles away at you. Today I want to just kind of bring to your attention the contrast between Esther and Haman. So Esther is a Jew, she's a believer, and despite the fact that her life and the life of all her people is under threat, she comes across as calm and controlled. And then we see Haman, who has in many ways the world at his feet, and yet he's irritable and irrational. So we're just going to follow the passage as Esther bravely goes to meet the king to plead for her people, that the Jews will not be exterminated, that you'll find some way to avoid the genocide. So we'll see three things today. First of all, Esther's trust. Secondly, Haman's turmoil. And then thirdly, God's timing. That's how I want to break it up today. Esther's trust, Haman's turmoil, God's timing. Just before that, to set the scene and quickly remind ourselves of where we left off last time. Chapter 4 ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. Esther has agreed to go and approach the king, even though she knows that doing so without an invitation often leads to sudden death. You see, this king, he was the most protected man on the planet. He had a guard standing beside him with a massive axe. And any unwanted visitors, any unwelcome visitors, had their heads chopped off. That's just the way it was. And Esther said at the end of chapter 16, she says, I'll go, okay, I'll go. And if I perish, I perish. And pretty much it kind of sounds like Russian roulette. And even if she does survive, so if the king is happy with the person that he sees there, he can allow them entry. But even if he allows her entry, what she's about to ask him is a virtual impossibility. If she's going to save the Jewish race, she has to ask the king to reverse an irreversible decree. Not just any decree, but one that was ordered by his best pal and that was stamped with the king's own signet ring. It really doesn't look likely. Stretching the bounds of possibility. And then she's got another problem as well. That she's going to have to tell the king that she's a Jew. 5 years they've been together. She's been hiding that fact from him. And now she's got to tell him. Rather you than me, Esther. So the stage is set. The drama is approaching its height. The tension really here is palpable. And it's as if the narrative goes into slow motion. Chapters 1 to 4 we've looked at. They cover a 10-year period. 4 chapters, 10 years. The next 4 chapters cover a 2-day period. So the story is being slowed right down. And the tension is being upped. So let's look then, first of all, today at Esther's thrust. The chapter begins by telling us these events took place on the 3rd day. What's that a reference to? The 3rd day of fasting and prayer. If you were here when we looked at chapter 4, Esther said, okay, I'll do this. I know it's a massive risk, but I will go to the king as long as all the Jews spend 3 days in fasting. The implication being that they would pray as well. We saw that prayer wasn't mentioned because the writer doesn't mention anything to do with God. You're meant to just understand it yourself. So 3 days of prayer and fasting. It's now the 3rd day, and she's going to go and she's going to see the king to plead for her people. Remember, they're all under threat of death, and they're hoping Esther can do something about that. So we're told in verse 1 as well that she puts on her royal robes. Now, that's probably different to how she would previously have gone. We know that she's previously gone in there to seduce the king. That's not what she's doing this time. She puts on her royal robes. Some people say she's power dressing. Don't think that's the case either. I believe the reason she puts on her royal robes is that she's come to believe and accept what Mordecai suggested to her in the last chapter. Maybe you have come to royal position for such a time as this. I believe that Esther has come to be convinced that yes, she's in royal position. Yes, she is queen of Persia at this time for this very purpose. So she gets her robes on. And you'll notice in verse 1 how the writer deliberately slows down the pace to raise the tension. Because he gives us loads of details, which really, most of it isn't necessary. Let's read verse 1. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. He could just have said she went where the king could see her while he's on his throne. But you get all this detail. It's basically to heighten the tension. She's standing there. She's breaking the law by doing that. And she's taking her life in her hands. Her head could come off. But then we're told that the king stretches out his scepter to invite her in. And we can breathe. The first obstacle is out of the way. She's survived that first hurdle. But then almost immediately she's put on the spot and he says, what are you after? What do you want, Esther? You see, the king knows that she's risked her life to be there. And so clearly there's something important she wants to ask him. And so again, the tension mounts. Will she tell him? Will she just spit it out? And if so, how will he respond? And then Esther speaks and she says, will you come to dinner? And it's like a huge anticlimax. You come to dinner? Did she just bottle it? Did she lose her nerve when it came to the crunch and the best she could do was think of a date night? No, Esther didn't lose her nerve. Esther is trusting God in this. And although she previously said, if I perish, I perish, I believe Esther has come to be convinced that God will save her here. And I think the evidence for that is that she's already prepared the feast that she is inviting the king to. You'll see that in verse 4. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. It's ready. It's ready right there and then. We can tell that from the rush in the following chapter. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we'll go to this banquet. So I think it's interesting that although Esther has realized she's where she is for that purpose, she's believed that she's got this thing to do from God, she has come to be convinced through her trust that she's going to survive it. She doesn't throw caution to the wind and just rush in there and blurt out what she wants. She's subtle, she's careful. And God gave us common sense for a reason. Just because we know that we've got something to do, and maybe it's for good, it's for God's cause, it's in God's service, doesn't mean we abandon the common sense that he's given us. We use everything God has given us in his service. Everything. And so she invites the king then to this feast, figuring that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. It's a fair assumption most of the time. I think Xerxes would have been unhappy if he didn't get an invitation to the WFM pudding evening as well. But she invites Haman as well, and that's odd. Why does she invite Haman? Haman's the enemy. You would think she would have wanted to get the king on side without the enemy present. So why is Haman there? Well, I'm not certain. I can't say I know for sure why Haman is there. It really goes against our human instinct for her to invite him. The only explanation I can offer you is that she felt led by God to invite him. Because the way things pan out after this would appear to lend weight to the fact that he was meant to be there. Because Haman, by getting this invitation, the only person invited to the queen's banquet, he becomes even more proud and even more arrogant than he already was. And the Bible tells us that pride comes before a fall. So I think Haman's there because God led her to invite him. Anyway, verse 5, the king summons Haman. They both head off to the banquet. And the he's obviously keen to find out what's on her mind. What does she want? And almost immediately he brings it up again. He spilled the beans, Esther, verse 6. As they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, what's your petition? It will be given you. And what's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Once again, we're on tenterhooks. What's she going to say? How's he going to react? And then she begins to tell him. Verse 7, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. And I don't know about you, I'm reading this and I'm saying, Esther, what are you playing at? You've got a fantastic opportunity right here and now to get it out there. The king, he's in good form. He's come to your feast. He's pretty much promised that he'll give her anything she wants. Why don't you tell him? Well, why not? Some say she's just playing him like a fish. She's showing who's in control. Well, it is amazing to see that Esther, who was powerless in chapter 4, that now the king and the prime minister are pretty much doing what she asks them. But I don't think it would be dangerous to play these men along. I don't think Esther would be doing such a thing. I think, again, that the reason she delays is that the Lord has prompted her. And as we go on and as we study this, we will see evidence that this day's delay was in God's plan. Because things are going to happen in the next 24 hours prior to that next feast things are going to happen that will ensure that Esther and her people are saved. I'll say a wee bit more about that under our next heading. But let's move on. That was Esther's trust. I want to look at Haman's turmoil, though, secondly. So he's the guy who decreed that all the Jews in the province should be eradicated just because one of them annoyed him. Just because Mordecai refused to bow down to him. Haman hated that. Because Haman was all about honour and prestige. People bowing to him. He loved that. He's chuffed to bits that the queen has invited him, and him only, to dine with herself and the king. He clearly didn't know about two's company, three's a crowd. So he goes there, and he's on a high. We read in verse 9 that he's on cloud 9 as he leaves the feast. Verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But it doesn't last, because he's not very far out the door when he sees Mordecai, who again doesn't bow to him, and that makes Haman furious. He's furious. This man is all about his ego. An invitation from the queen boosts his ego. He's so happy. And then an insignificant thing, like a little known Jew, refuses to bow down to him. And his ego is dented. And he's miserable again. He's miserable. And if we're relying on this world's pleasures for our contentment, they'll let you down. It will not work. And that's because this world's pleasures are inadequate to meet our greatest need. Our greatest need is spiritual. It's spiritual. You were made to be in relationship with God. And anything less than that will leave you discontent. You may have some short-term highs, but nothing will truly satisfy you but a relationship with the God who made you and who made you for relationship with him. Haman's idol was popularity. He loved the praise. He wanted people to look up to him. He wanted people to respect him. And just because this one man didn't, it spoilt his whole life. But then we see that he picks up his ego off the floor and he begins to inflate it again himself. He goes home, verse 11, and he starts to boast to his friends and his family. He invites them all. He boasts, verse 12, verse 11, about his vast wealth, about his kids, about the positions he's been given by the king, and now the fact that even the queen is honouring him. As well, little does he know what the queen really thinks about him. Here's a man who's trying to big himself up, to make himself feel good. And it's really pathetic. And he is really sad. And I just want to draw your attention this morning to the turmoil of this man's life. I want you to notice the mood swings that Haman goes through. He's up and down like a yo-yo. Even in these few verses that deal with him in chapter 5, from verse 9 to verse 14, his mood changes 5 times. 5 changes of mood. 6 different moods in 6 verses. Verse 9, we read he's happy and in high spirits. Let's count that as one mood. Moments later, he's enraged. Then in verse 10, he's restrained, we're told. By verse 11, he's back in full flow. He's boasting to his friends. Come down to verse 13, we read at the start, he concedes that actually he's got no satisfaction. No satisfaction. And then when they suggest a solution, verse 14, we're told that he's happy and delighted. Once again, poor Haman, there's this turmoil in his head and in his heart. I wonder if you can follow any of that today. And you understand that roller coaster of emotions that are dictated by circumstances. Something happens and you're on a high. Something else happens and you're in the pits. Does that seem to be the story of your life? Dissatisfaction for the most part, with the occasional blip, the occasional thrill, the occasional high. Why is that? Well, for Haman, certainly, it was because he had no God but himself. Haman worshipped himself. Life was all about him. All about his achievements, his accolades, and so on. And although he had done okay for himself, he was in high position, and yet he's nevertheless a man in turmoil. A man in turmoil. Such a massive contrast between him and Esther. She's trusting the Lord, and she has this calmness and this composure about her, despite the fact that her life is in danger. Haman's friends and family, they're no real help to him, because they don't know God, so they can't point him to the Lord and say, this is what you need. So instead they point him to revenge and say, this is what you need. And he goes, yeah, you're right. That'll boost my ego again. And we see that's what happens. In the last verse, he has this massive scaffold built on which he's going to hang Mordecai. And we're told that Haman is delighted. Delighted once again. Why? Why is he like that? Why is Haman's head and heart so full of turmoil? Why does his happiness evaporate so easily? Well, it's because it has no sure foundation. It has no sure foundation. The only foundation that guarantees your contentment today is to trust in Jesus Christ. The only foundation. But I need to move on and look at God's timing. So we've seen Esther's trust, we've seen Haman's turmoil, thirdly, God's timing. And God's timing, I believe, is the only way that we can explain the repeated delays of Esther. We can only explain it by the fact that God must have instructed her to wait. And we say, well, you're not told that. No, you're not told that. In fact, in the book of Esther, you're not told anything that is unseen. Okay. In other books of the Bible, we're told when the Lord told, the Lord pointed so-and-so, the Lord instructed so-and-so. You're not told any of that in Esther. But as the reader of this story, we are meant to see that God must be in this. And that conclusion, I would suggest to you, seems to force itself on us in this story. Because what we see happening overnight, in that delay prior to Esther's next feast, two things happen that are of great significance, and that will determine the outcome of this entire story. The first is in the closing verse of chapter 5, where Haman has this massive structure of death built, intending to have Mordecai publicly impaled on it. And then at the beginning of chapter 6, which we'll look at next time, the king has a sleepless night where he gets some old books to read to bore him to sleep. And he finds in one of these books that Mordecai saved his life once. And Mordecai foiled a plot to kill the king. And so by the following day, while the king is ready to honor Mordecai, Haman is desperate to obliterate Mordecai. And so all of a sudden, these two who were best buddies at Esther's first feast are at odds with one another by the time of her second feast. And that, friends, is God's doing. That's God's doing. You see, God's timing is always perfect. We get frustrated with it. We get frustrated just reading this story and seeing Esther dilly-dallying, as it were. And you're saying, get a move on. Just say what you've got to say, woman. Behind it all, there is a divine architect working everything out to his timetable. His timetable. Maybe in your own life today you're frustrated with God. You're frustrated with his timetable. You're waiting, you're longing, you're praying for him to intervene in some situation in your life. You're trying to force him. Just trust him. His timing's perfect. I just want to draw your attention to one more thing that we see at the start of chapter 5 with regard to God's timing. So we read these words, the opening words of the chapter, on the third day. I mentioned this was the third day of fasting and prayer, but I think they're more significant than that, because on the third day is always significant in the Bible. It is significant as a day of salvation. So listen to Hosea 6. It speaks about God's deliverance of his people. And it says, after 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will restore us so that we may live in his presence. On the third day he'll restore us so that we may live in his presence. And if you read your Bible, you'll find several instances of God intervening on the third day to save someone. So think about Isaac, for instance. His father Abraham was going to sacrifice him. And we're told that they journeyed 3 days to Mount Moriah. And it was on the third day that God intervened and saved Isaac's life. And he saved Isaac for a purpose. It would be through Isaac that all the Lord's people, all the Israelites, would be blessed. Or think of Jonah. Jonah's in the belly of the big fish for 3 days. And it's on the third day that God intervenes. The fish vomits him out for a reason. Jonah will become the means of saving 120,000 people in the city of Nineveh. And then we come to Esther. And Esther here, it's on the third day of fasting and prayer, where they've been living in the fear and the shadow of death, that Esther was spared. And she was spared for a reason. She would become the means of saving all God's people, the Jews. And you can maybe work out where I'm going next. To Jesus. All these Old Testament characters are pointing us forward to Jesus, who laid down his life, and on the third day God raised him from the dead. And God raised him from the dead for a purpose: to save everyone who would put their trust in him. And today it is because of that third day, it is because of Christ's death and resurrection, that the God who sits on the throne of heaven stretches out his scepter to invite you to come to him, to welcome you into his family, and to assure you of a place in heaven if you will but trust him. God's timing, it's always perfect. And in the Bible, God says about today, he says, now is the accepted time. Today is the day of salvation. And I can tell you with the authority of the Bible that if you come to the Lord today, he will save your soul for eternity. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you this morning for the story that we're studying. It's an interesting story. It's an exciting story. But it points us to the greatest ever story, that of God loving this world so much, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Help us, Lord, to believe today. For we ask this in his name. Amen. We're going to conclude our service singing in Psalm 10 on page 12. Psalm 10, it's not a psalm we sing all that often. We're going to sing from the last 4 verses, from verse 15 to the end of the psalm, the bottom of page 12. Lord, break the wicked person's power, and call him to account for all the evil which he thought would never be found out. The Lord will ever reign as king. His throne will always stand. The heathen nations of the world will perish from his land. From the last 4 verses of Psalm 10, standing to sing.
Lord, break the way.